Okay, let's talk about chemical interactions within the body. Chemical interactions within the body are no different than interactions between individuals, organisms, animals throughout our environment. Some get along, some don't. So when I talk about chemical interactions, I'm talking about specific type of molecules getting along with each other, atoms. Do atoms have equal value, ions, what have you? So let's take a closer look at this. Now, water is super important because 60 to 70% of our body is composed of water. So that's really going to be our starting point when we're looking at chemical interactions within the body. Keep in mind that water is both a substance, something we drink, something we swim in, but it is also a molecule. So this is the water molecule, or we're speaking of molecular water. Okay. So when we look at the water molecule is similar to just about every other molecule we're going to be dealing with in this class. It is a molecule. There's 3 atoms here. The hydrogen atoms are bound to the oxygen atom via covalent bonds. So covalent bonds are the sharing of electrons. That is what creates the bonds. In purple, we see the electrons that are being shared by the oxygen. But one thing we'll see is those sharing of electrons are not equal amongst all other molecules. So in this case, there is an unequal sharing of electrons. And we see those electrons being pushed closer or pulled closer to the oxygen atom. And that is because the oxygen atom is much more electronegative than the hydrogen atoms. So one thing I want to be clear about, oxygen and hydrogen, oxygen and the 2 hydrogens in this molecule, there is still the sharing of electrons. It is just an unequal sharing or unequal distribution of the electrons, where the electrons are pulled closer to. That's going to be the case with some other atoms. But what we see here is these electrons have been pulled closer to the oxygen atom. And as a result, it imparts partial negative charges on the oxygen atom, as we see on the upper right and left, here and here. Those are partial negative charges, and that's because the oxygen is holding those electrons closer to it. The electrons, of course, have a negative charge. As a result of those electrons being pulled further away from the hydrogen atoms have a partial positive charge on each of them right here. So there are 2 partial positive charges in the water molecule and 2 partial negative charges in the water molecule. Because there's 2 partial negative charges and 2 partial positive charges, those cancel each other out, and water is a neutral molecule, neutral with regard to charge. There is no overall charge to the water molecule. There's certainly to the hydronium, to the hydroxide, to the lone hydrogen atom, but this water molecule is neutral. It has no charge, but it is polar. We say it's a polar molecule because the characteristics on one end of the molecule are different from the other end of the molecule. Specifically, negative on one end, positive on the other. That makes it polar, just like a battery that has a positive charge on one side and a negative charge on the other side. Okay, so this is just an example of another polar molecule. This is glucose, and glucose is going to be a molecule we talk about almost every lecture, if not every lecture. It is super important to our body. It is that fuel source we talked about that helps us produce ATP. Glucose is a polar molecule because we see a number of oxygen atoms in this molecule. And these oxygen atoms are bound to hydrogen. As a result, that's going to produce or create a number of regions in this molecule that have a partial negative region and a partial positive region, creating what we refer to as a polar molecule. There are a litany of polar molecules in the body. I've just mentioned water and glucose, and we'll look at others as we move forward. Okay, if we have polar molecules, that means we also have nonpolar molecules. This right here is a fatty acid. It is a nonpolar molecule because the majority of this molecule is merely carbon and hydrogen. So for now, we're just going to forget about the hydroxide on the left side of this molecule because the majority of it is carbon and hydrogen. And to review some chemistry, all the vertices on this fatty acid represent a carbon. And coming off of each carbon are two assumed hydrogen atoms. So this molecule would look more something like this if we were to write it out. At each vertex, you'd have a carbon and two hydrogen. Because carbon and hydrogen are pretty much electrically equal, they're not going to pull the electrons away from each other, and they're not going to create any sort of polarity. So nonpolar molecules tend to be things like fats, lipids, steroids, triglycerides. Okay, so as we look at polar molecules get along with each other. Nonpolar molecules get along with each other, but nonpolar and polar don't get along. So polar molecules we refer to as being hydrophilic. They are water-loving. And water is used as the baseline here because water is the most predominant molecule in the body, and it is polar. So polar molecules, such as glucose, are hydrophilic. But they do not get along with nonpolar molecules. If you put nonpolar molecules and polar molecules together, they do not get along. So a polar molecule is what's referred to as lipophobic. So those are two terms that characterize a polar molecule. It is hydrophilic and lipophobic. Nonpolar molecules, on the other hand, they have a fear of water or other polar molecules. So a nonpolar molecule would be hydrophobic, but lipophilic. Quick review, polar molecules are hydrophilic and lipophobic, whereas nonpolar molecules are lipophilic and hydrophobic. These terms are really saying the same thing. If something is hydrophilic, it is going to be lipophobic. If something is lipophilic, it's going to be hydrophobic. Now, this gets a little confusing when we look at amphipathic molecules. And amphipathic molecules are molecules that have both a polar region and a nonpolar region. What I have drawn here is what's known as a phospholipid. It is the molecule that makes up the phospholipid bilayer of the plasma membrane. So we've described the plasma membrane of cells being composed of phospholipids, and this is one phospholipid, which is an amphipathic molecule. The head of the phospholipid is polar. It is the polar region of this molecule because it has a positive part to the phospholipid head and a negative part. So the head itself is polar, but the tails, these purple tails here, are composed merely of carbon and hydrogen, making them non-polar. So an amphipathic molecule has a polar region and a non-polar region. So this is a really cool image, maybe not that cool, but it illustrates something really important to human physiology. That is to say, the reaction an amphipathic molecule will have to water, specifically what this phospholipid does when it interacts with water. If we were to drop this phospholipid into a glass of water and we are not dictating what that phospholipid is supposed to do, it's going to orient as follows. The lipid tails are sticking up and out of the water because they do not want to interact with water because they are hydrophobic. They fear water. Whereas the polar head of this phospholipid loves to interact with water because polar molecules love to interact with each other. Water is polar. The phosphate head is polar. So it's going to embed itself within the water. Okay, so let's take a look at this slide right here. And what I'm showing you on the left here is the cell membrane of a typical human cell. It's composed of phospholipids, the phospholipid bilayer that we see right here. If I simplify this picture, there's an inner circle and an outer circle that we see over here. Oftentimes, I draw cells merely as one circle because it's much faster to draw. But that one circle really is representing these two lines, or specifically these two lines. So you have a phosphate head here and phosphate heads out here. This is the phospholipid bilayer. And these phospholipids are oriented this way because we have water on the outside of the cell in the extracellular fluid, and we have water inside the cell, which is the intracellular fluid or the cytosol. That is why the phospholipid bilayer orients this way. And so the chemical nature, the biochemical nature of this phospholipid bilayer is also going to dictate what moves into the cell and out of the cell. And we will talk about that in a later video.